So, uh, that's the end. I've been reading this relatively short trilogy. I've been reading it for so long at this point. What with everything that happened, that it feels weird to finally be done with it. This was like a major part of my life, and a thing I kept thinking about for like 6 months. I think at this point almost. Um, but yeah, I'm actually done with the Soldier Son trilogy, finally. Um, and I have some very complicated and mixed feelings about this last section. Um, one, this video might be a bit shorter than you might expect for the finale, in part because this last section doesn't deal with a ton of the themes of the rest of the trilogy, and that's part of what makes it such a weird ending. Um, like I said in the last video, most of the stuff that matters to the themes of this series kind of got wrapped up last time, or arguably in the first chapter of this section. But yeah, it's there's not really a lot more to say about this section, because it mostly just deals with wrapping up some loose ends, some of which I'm not sure should have been wrapped up. Uh, um, but uh, I will get to that. Uh, so, where do we start this section? We start this section with Nivare slash Soldier's Boy, the combined entity, being eaten by a tree. And there's a very really unexpected moment there where Likari's eulogy for Nivare briefly dwells on the fact that Nivare had really bad farts, which was such a jarring tonal shift for this series to make. I was so unprepared for that moment. But uh, then we get back to the usual tone of this series, um, with the genuinely horrifying moments of body horror that Robin Hobb uses to describe the process of the Kembra tree essentially devouring Nivare's body, and the fact that he's basically conscious for the process and can feel it happening is horrifying. um, but he makes it through, and he becomes part of Lysana's tree, and it's like the perfect happy ending for Soldier's Boy. Um, I obviously knew that this wouldn't last, because there were 8 chapters left in the book. Um, so I I was not surprised when what happened next happened. Well, I was surprised at specifically what happened next, but I was not surprised that something happened to steal Nivare's eternity away from him. Um, Orangula arrives, claims his price, and the thing that's interesting is Nivare, at Lysana's urging, chooses to give chooses to give Orangula his death instead of his life, because that was the choice that Orangula kept giving him. And what this ends up meaning for Orangula's in Orangula's mind is he essentially brings Nivare back to life. He rips his soul out of the Kembra tree, and he makes a new body for him. It's kind of implied that he basically carves Nivare's larger body down into the shape of his old body, and somehow that results in like a functional whole human body, which, I mean, obviously this is like literally god powers, so it makes sense that it works. But it's just such an interesting and horrifying mental image, like Nivare waking up inside like the ripped open remains of his own body and like basically crawling out of himself. Uh, really, really visceral and horrifying mental image, and really cool mental image as well. I really like that whole scene. Um, Although I do have some problems with it, which we'll get to in a moment. But uh, essentially, Navarre has been torn in half again, with Soldier's Boy staying with Lysana in the tree, and Navarre getting to be his old self, free of the magic, and also thin, um, and alive again. And all before I go further, I do kind of have to wonder what would have happened if Navarre had chosen to give his life to Orandula. Because the thing that I'm thinking is maybe nothing. Um, because Navarre was already dead. Maybe Orandula would have simply killed the tree, I guess. But I don't know. If if Orandula would have simply killed the tree and 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 ended Navarre's life that way, I feel like that wouldn't be an equal choice to choosing death. And he is the god of balances, so I feel like he would have wanted the choices to be balanced. So in my mind, I feel like what the choice actually was a choice between life inside the tree with Lysana and life as a mortal man outside of it. Um, that's actually the choice that was being offered here. So I think maybe if Navarre had chosen to give his life, or Anjula would have said, "Yeah, you already have. You're dead. Cool," and just fucked off. Uh, but maybe I'm wrong, and we'll probably never know because that's not what happened. Um, so Navarre's alive again, except he's not alive in the Spec Lands. That's really interesting. In the Spec Lands, he is dead, metaphysically dead. Like he is a ghost to the Specs. Most of them can't even see him, and those that can think he's a spirit, and they are able to ward against him using salt. Uh, which, yeah, that seems to imply that he literally is a ghost when he's physically in the Spec Lands. Although he does have a physical body, like he can touch things, but he functions as a ghost. It's a really weird concept that I've never seen before. Like the idea that someone, he's essentially Schrodinger's ghost. Like he's a ghost and a living man at the same time, depending on where he is and who he's interacting with. Yeah, that's a really interesting concept and really well conveyed. I really like that whole section where he realizes that that's what's happening. Orandula says something weird here. Orandula says that the reason Navarre is both dead and alive is because when Orandula tried to take his ghost, he essentially had to fight another god for Navarre. And then Navarre says, "Oh, you mean Lysana? Because Lysana is the one who like grabbed him by the hair and kept Soldier's Boy in the tree." And then Orandula says, "No, not her. She's not a god." So I'm confused. Who exactly did Orandula fight for Navarre's soul? Because it's not like my first thought was, is this like a weird confirmation that the good god is real? But no, Orandula himself makes it very clear that as far as he knows, there's no such thing as the good god. And in fact, he posits a very not very cool theory about the good god, which I really like, from like a theological perspective. But we'll get to that in a moment. I guess maybe the forest itself. I guess the forest itself is the god that acted through, or well, the forest or the magic, as we've been calling it throughout this book. Um, yeah, That's interesting. Um, anyway, Navarre goes back to Guernian civilization, reconnects with uh, Spink and Epinny, and uh, was it Casey or Ebrooks? I genuinely forget which one of the Graveyard Boys, because I kind of mixed them up. One of those guys. Um, and from that point on, we just start a new plot, which is a bold choice this late in the book. Essentially, Robin Hobb does a scouring of the Shire, uh, except the Shire, except the scouring of the Shire in this case is a confrontation with Christian fundamentalism. Basically. So Captain Thayer, Carsina's ex-husband, has gone mad because he both because of what Navarre did when he made him think that he'd killed Navarre and had Amzil raped, um, and because of the fact that since then he's discovered from Carsina's letters that she was in fact betrothed to Navarre, and he suspects that she was also cheating on him with Navarre, which she wasn't. So basically, he's gone full Christian fundamentalist. To be clear, I say Christian because obviously they're not Christians specifically. There's no Jesus, but it is very, very, very clear, and I don't think I need to explain this particularly, but it's very clear that the faith of the good God in these books is just Christianity. Like it's clearly meant to just be a stand-in for Christianity, in pretty much every way except the existence of a Jesus figure specifically. Um, so yeah, that's yeah, he's a Christian fundamentalist, Captain Thayer. So um, so yeah, that's the final boss. The final boss of the Soldier Son trilogy, unexpectedly, is Christian fundamentalism, um, which on some level makes sense for a story about colonialism because, of course, Christianity is a large part of the driving force behind historical colonialism. So it makes sense for that to be sort of the last thing that needs to be dealt with, even though it doesn't need to be dealt with in the context of colonialism, more in the context of like internal situation within the Christian culture. Um, but I like the fact that this final confrontation is with Captain Thayer, who has arrested Amzil and wants to execute her. Um, and I like that Navarre, even though he has lost his vicious side in Soldier's Boy, um, is still willing to view Captain Thayer as a hateful bigot who should be slain. Um, because that's the only way to deal with this situation. Like, Captain Thayer is too ideologically fascist to even, like, he cannot be reasoned with. Once someone is that far gone down the far right rabbit hole, you can't. Sometimes you can bring them back, but you certainly can't reliably bring them back. And Navarre does his best. He gives the old college try to save Captain Thayer from himself, but ultimately Captain Thayer does need to die, which which is unfortunate, but also fairly true to life with how historically it has usually gone when the far right is in power. Um, they don't generally respond well to conversation. Um, so, Captain Thayer, well, I say dies. Captain Thayer is apparently still alive, but with brain damage. I honestly kind of would have been better to just kill him, but I guess this way Navarre got off scot-free, so cool. Um, So, Navarre and Amsel escape. They are briefly accosted by Tiber, by Scout Tiber, and Tiber is so cool in this scene where he lets Amsel and Navarre go, and so cool in his description of his philosophy and why he's letting them go, and in his attitude, and so cool in how he like senses that Sam is gonna hit him with a rock and like jokes with Sam about it and tells him to get a better rock or whatever. I want a book about Tiber. Please give me a book about Tiber. I want this guy's adventures. I want to know what Tiber's up to, what he does with his life after this. Please. He's so cool. But Tiber aside, Amsel and Navarre start their new life together. There's a weird thing about not having sex until they're married, which I don't like. I don't like that we're. I'll get to this in a moment, actually, because I have issues with this. But Navarre gets his happily ever after, essentially. After this, he gets to be with the woman he loves. He helps her raise her children, who are now his children as well. Eventually, he gets a letter from his uncle inviting him back to White Vale, telling him he's now his father's heir, offering him a full commission with the Kavala, etc., etc., etc. Basically, everything he's ever dreamed of. And here is where I have a problem with this ending. So, I think that everything that happens up until Navarre and Amsel flee from Geddes is really cool, and I like it. In fact, everything that happens up until the encounter with Tiber is really cool, and I really like it. If the book had ended with like this open-ended, like, oh, Navarre, like right after the encounter with Tiber, is where I would have ended the book. Like, oh, they've gotten away from this, Tiber has let them go, and they're going off to start their new life together. And, you know, it might be a hard life, but they'll make it. And just leave it at that. I think that would have been a fantastic ending. But what actually happens is something I'm much more torn about. Because what we end up with is a far too perfect ending, in my opinion. And when I say perfect, I mean perfect, obviously, from Navarre's perspective, but from my perspective, it's a very flawed ending. Not just because it's quote unquote too perfect, like Navarre getting to be his father's heir, getting his father's forgiveness, getting to go to the Kavala, like everything he ever wanted is just handed to him on a silver platter at the end. I don't know, feels off to me, but I would actually be okay with that if it didn't also mean a full return to the status quo. And that's what I really have a problem with here. I take issue with the fact that essentially, after all this time, after this whole journey, Navarre just chooses to go back to being exactly who his father always wanted him to be. He fully embraces Guernian values, Guernian culture. He wants to be in the Kavala. He chooses to be in the Kavala to serve the king. He wants to be his father's heir, to be a noble within this horrific system. And that feels wrong to me, frankly. I feel like after everything that's happened, Navarre should reject Guernian culture. I don't mean reject it in the sense of like, oh, I'm gonna go live in the forest. I mean reject it in the sense of, no, I no longer value military service. I no longer value patriotism and loyalty to the king. I no longer want to be a noble within this horrific system. And instead, he seems to just be fully back on board with pretty much all the beliefs and ideological positions he held at the start of the first book. Like, when he was still fully fully in hero worship mode towards his father. And that really upsets me. That's not a happy ending. That's a tragic ending presented as a happy ending. Navarre had freedom. He was free from this incredibly abusive, religiously conservative, militaristic culture. And then in the end, he just chooses to go back to it and fully embrace it as if nothing he's been through happened. What was the point of all those conversations between Navarre and Soldier's Boy, where Navarre was able to recognize, seemingly through Soldier's Boy's perspective, the harm that Guernian society has done to him personally? And also, what was the point of Navarre's whole journey towards recognizing that Guernia is being a horrifically violent colonial power towards the Specs? What was the point of Navarre having the falling out with his father, and coming to recognize his father as the abusive monster he was? What was the point of all that if he just forgets all about it in the end and just goes back? It's, I don't know. It's a deeply, deeply depressing ending for me. The idea that Navarre is just back to being who he was always, quote unquote, supposed to be according to Guernian rules is just, and the premarital sex thing is a part of that. Like, I understand why Amzil, like, from like a from the perspective of a woman who has been taken advantage of by men before, I understand why Amzil wants that, why she wants to wait for marriage. But I'm still a bit uncomfortable with the fact that it's kind of presented as like, the universally correct choice. Like, oh, obviously Navarre is now a good person, so the right thing to do is to not have sex until marriage. Uh, and Amzil as well, like, she's like been redeemed. It almost feels like she's being redeemed for her prior sins by waiting for marriage. I don't know. There's like this whole ending is weirdly conservative, and I don't like it. Um, and it especially strikes me as weird after how hard the book went against Captain Thayer's conservatism. So, I don't know. If I could have picked the perfect ending for Navarre, I would have either had him reject. I would have had the offer from Widevale arrive, but have Navarre reject it. Have him say, no, I'm not going back in the military. I'm not going to be my father's heir. My life is here in this little village with Amzil, and we're going to make the best of it. And this is how we're going to live. And I'm never going to serve the king again. And I'm never going to see my father again because he's a monster. So I would have either had that ending, or I would have had the offer from his uncle never even arrive, and instead have Navarre be officially dead as far as his family was concerned, and have him enlist in the military and maybe eventually become a scout. Because there was so much buildup throughout this book, and especially here at the ending with the callbacks to both Tiber and the scout from the very first chapter of the first book. It felt like the book was so obviously building up from way back at the start of the first book towards Navarre eventually becoming a scout, that it's genuinely weird that he didn't. I don't. Did Robin Hobb originally plan for him to become a scout and then just gave up, changed her mind? I don't know. It feels like such obvious buildup, literally from the first chapter of the first book. It has been built up that Navarre is obviously going to be a scout. It just feels wrong that it never happens. I don't know. I'm just everything about this final chapter rubs me the wrong way. The fact that this is how Nevare's story ended. It's I don't know. It's so disappointing. Uh, it reminds me of the infamous Harry Potter epilogue, which everyone obviously hates. Um, yeah, I don't think a story like this should end with, and then everyone went back to the status quo, and everything was exactly the same as it always was, and everyone was happy with everything being the same, and everyone lived with a white picket fence and 2.5 children. Like, don't do that. Don't end stories that way. That's a stupid way for a story to end. And and a deeply conservative one. I just don't like that. Anyway, rant about the ending over. I do want to talk about something I really liked here at the end. Um, I'm going to end on a very positive note, which is I really like the fact that in the end, Lysana and Soldier's Boy are antagonists. Lysana and Soldier's Boy try to murder Anvil and her child in order to end Nevare himself because Lysana wants Nevare in the tree with her, whether or not he wants that. And he doesn't at this point. And I really like that touch because I think that this series has been way too easy on Lysana at times. Because the thing we need to remember about Lysana is that everything she did in the name of defending her people, in my opinion, was justified. I think that, like, I ended the first book in which she was presented as a villain. I ended the first book fully on Lysana's side. But as time went on, and as Lysana was presented as more and more of a, like, love interest for Nevare, I started to realize that her motivations were a lot less pure than that. Lysana obviously did everything she did at the Magic's behest, because the Magic wanted to stop the colonization and all that, and that is fine. I'm fine with her doing all that shit at the Magic's behest. What I'm not fine with is the fact that she basically, uh, well, there's no other word for it. She groomed Nevare from childhood, to be her lover. And this started when he was 15. Uh, like, the whole relationship Lysana and Nevare have is a deeply, deeply fucked up one. And I feel like at times the book has failed to acknowledge that. It has been shown as like this mutual love and affection between the two. Um, and that makes me very uncomfortable. Because, not to put too fine a point on it, but the woman is a pedophile. And, I'm that has not necessarily been acknowledged, but what has been acknowledged here at the end is that Lysana does not really love Nevare. Lysana wants Nevare, and she is willing to completely ignore his wishes and his consent in order to have him. She wants to own him. She wants him as property. She wants him as something to have. She feels that it is her due as a great one because she was denied it in life to have a family, and she is willing to do anything to have one, even disregard the explicit wishes and consent of the person who she supposedly loves. And like I said, I don't think the book acknowledges that enough throughout. I still feel like there is a romanticization of the relationship, and I'm still a little bit uncomfortable with the fact that Soldier's Boy's happily ever after is to be with Lysana in the tree instead of to realize what she's done to him. Um, but I am happy that the last we see of Lysana in this book is as an abusive and possessive monster. trying to literally kill the person she loves because he doesn't want to be with her. Because that is what she's been all along. It's just the book just hasn't really acknowledged that that's what she is. Um, so yeah, that is the ending of the Soldier Sun trilogy. Oh, I didn't talk about some of the stuff I talked about last week actually. So I do want to just point out my criticism from last week's video about the way the female characters have been written as the series has gone on is still valid. Epini and Olikea never recovered their fire, never recovered their personalities really from motherhood. They remained these loving motherly figures right up to the end, and that sucks, if you ask me. It sucks that Epini, who was my favorite character, didn't end up being very relevant to the plot ultimately, which I'm shocked by. It felt like she was so obviously set up as the female lead of the story for the first two books, and then in this third book she like didn't do anything. Like, I mean, she did at the start, but like I really expected whatever climactic final event was going to happen in this book. I really expected Epini to be extremely central to it. And she just wasn't. And she's just been like softened by motherhood and marriage, and now she's like she's basically she's gone from being someone who was willing to go against all societal convention, fight against her own culture at every turn in order to carve out the life that she wanted. She went to being someone who is largely just a perfect Ghanaian housewife, except she's like a little feisty, and that's seen as like her like the thing that stops her from being the perfect Ghanaian housewife. But other than that, she just is one, and I hate that. So yeah, overall, that's another way in which this book ends up going weirdly conservative at the end. Yeah, that's I guess that's my overall verdict for this final section. There's a lot to love here, and it doesn't it doesn't invalidate the rest of the series, which was really good all the way through. But at the end of the day, the ending is just disappointingly conservative. It and seems, at least to me, to go against most of the themes and values that have been woven through the rest of the series. And it kind of makes me question, in hindsight, whether those themes and values were ever really there, or whether I was just reading them into the story. Was this story always a deeply conservative one? Was this story always was I not supposed to hate Ghanaian society and culture? Was I supposed to be on Garnia's side the whole time? Were the Specs supposed to be the antagonists? I don't think so. That's not how the story felt to me the whole way through, but it is how it ended. And that's weird. So yeah, that's that's the note I'm going to end on. This ending makes me feel weird about both about the ending and about the whole series. Um, I will. This is very much not the end of me thinking and talking about this particular series, because this series will play a probably fairly central role in my doctoral dissertation. So I will be coming back to the Soldier Sun trilogy at a later date, and maybe that will change my feelings about it a bit. Who knows? But until that time, I leave on this kind of awkward and weird feeling. Um, Yeah, and I also don't know what I'm reading next. I haven't decided yet. So there may be a little bit of a hiatus here on the channel, while I choose what to read and maybe build up a bit of a backlog. Uh, we'll see. And also, I'm going on a trip now, so I won't really be in a position to record anything. So I will see you all at some point in the near future. Probably not next week, though. See ya. Bye.